All right. Good morning, everybody. Plenty of great seats up front. And they're in back. Welcome to folks who are watching the live stream or watching the video later. Glad you are all here. And I'm going to jump right into it because we've got three books today. 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. Anybody remember ever hearing a sermon on any of these books? No memory? There's one nod. Anybody else? Anybody ever heard a sermon? 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy. Anybody ever heard them read? Some? All right. A lot of passages from some of these books sometimes appear in ordination services, which is interesting. But I don't often hear them on an ordinary Sunday morning. So there's that, and we'll talk about why that is in just a minute. But no church gathering is complete unless you start with announcements. And so here they go. The first one you probably guessed. We have a video on these three books with Laura Holmes from Wesley Seminary in Washington, D.C. Find that online. We spend time talking about the books in general and a passage in 2 Timothy in particular, which I'll also talk about today. And then you should know that Church in the Round is coming back this Lent. We've had this for multiple Lents now. And when does Lent begin? I think it's 5th of March sounds right to me for Ash Wednesday. So that's about 5 weeks from today, I guess that means, right? Beginning March 9th, we will be meeting in small groups. If you don't know what Church in the Round is, during Lent we spend 5 weeks in small groups for discussions once a week. Those are typically, most of them meet Sunday mornings at this hour. They also meet at other times during the week. You can register for that on Realm. If you don't know what Realm is, I can help you with that afterwards. But yeah, registration is open for that. Highly recommended. All right, we're going to start with a chance to discuss something. So this is a quick discussion. You don't need to get up and move or anything like that. But imagine you've been given power to name a church, to give a church a name. What would you call it, is my question. St. Matthew's is my choice, but that's, maybe you want to call it Grace Church, or maybe you just want to call it Fifth Independent or something like that. Or churches, of course, have a variety of names. If anybody even know what Westminster is, that would be a great question to answer. There's something like 25 Westminster Presbyterian churches in the U.S., maybe more. So yeah, just pair up with somebody, and I'll just give you like a minute to talk about what would you name a church if you had the opportunity to give a church a name. All right, I told you to be quick. We're going to regather. Lots of names of churches out there. Just hold on to that for now, and we'll come back to that in just a minute when we talk about kind of how we understand what the church is and what the church is supposed to be in the world. I'm going to jump right into these three letters and introduce them somewhat quickly, just kind of outline them. 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. So just some basic information about them that you should know. Collectively, they're often referred to as the pastoral letters. This doesn't mean that the other letters that bear Paul's name aren't concerned with pastoral issues, taking care of people, offering guidance. It just means that these three letters are addressed not to congregations, but to individual church leaders. So the first two, you probably guessed, are addressed to Timothy, and the third one addressed to Titus, who are each leading certain churches. Timothy is in Ephesus, according to the letters, and Titus got lucky. He's on Crete, so he's got an island for his parish. So they're addressed to individual associates of Paul. So this is Paul giving pastoral advice, right, from one leader to other leaders, is the way the letters unfold. One of the things that's interesting about them is these three letters have more in common with each other than any of them do with other letters that we've studied so far. So we have already examined, how many? 10 letters that bear Paul's name, and these are the final three. There's 13 letters total in the New Testament that bear Paul's name. And these three, in a sense, are outliers because they have so many similarities, so many ways in which kind of the hand or the voice behind the letter appears to be the same, and it appears that they also circulated as a group or in a collection for some time in the early church before the Bible was actually put together. So that it's easy to kind of discuss them all at once. They're not very long, 6 chapters, 4 chapters, 3 chapters is the length. They have a distinctive vocabulary too, which also sets them apart from the other letters that we've looked at so far. If you take away the proper nouns, right, people's names, place names in these letters, there are about 850 Greek words that appear in them, and about 1/3 of those words don't appear in any of the other letters that we're certain that Paul wrote. That makes sense? So just kind of like a statistical analysis of vocabulary shows kind of a preference for different terms. And many of those words, many of those unique words, whatever 1/3 of 850 is, let's say like about 275, a lot of those words, a significant amount of those words are more common, or at least are somewhat more common in late 1st century philosophical and moralistic writings and early 2nd century. So again, if you do that statistical analysis of just the vocabulary, compare that to other surviving Greek literature, these letters feel much more at home in the late 1st century, early 2nd century. Does that make sense? In terms of, you can do that with ourselves, right? Now with AI, you can kind of instantly pull something up and it will tell you, who it sounds like. The letters also have a distinctive syntax. The style of writing is more complex than what we've seen in the letters that we're pretty sure that Paul wrote. They also have a thematic, kind of a distinctive thematic focus. They're the themes, right? They have this pronounced interest in the church's leadership structures. They're very interested in what it looks like to lead, what are the qualifications of people who occupy leadership positions. They mention, and this is especially true in 1 Timothy and in Titus, they mention certain offices in the church. They mention bishops, they mention deacons, they mention, this is exciting for us, elders. Right? In Greek, presbyteros is the Greek word for elder, which is where the word Presbyterian comes from. Not because we're all old, but because we have a system of governance, of leadership that refers to people as elders. And of course, we have this really odd expression. We refer to youth elders sometimes. Understand there's different ways of being an elder and accumulating wisdom than just, living a long time. But these letters are concerned with these offices, and we haven't seen references to these offices in the other letters of Paul that we've examined so far, with the exception of Philippians. Well, Romans has a deacon in it as well. But in Paul's earliest letters, there's no real reference to what the titles are for people who have leadership roles in churches. Now, all of a sudden, it looks like things are much more formalized, right? Much more structured in these. Bishop just means, by the way, overseer is the term for that. Deacon has a sense of helper. Typically, it's used around hospitality issues, right? So about delivering food, serving food, those types of things, but also extends beyond that in the way in which we see it used, has some kind of spiritual leadership aspect in it in terms of like teaching and community gathering and formation. So these letters are interested in that. Some of the familiar terms and topics that we've seen from the letters we've also explored so far are just absent from here. Some of Paul's kind of favorite theological jargon doesn't show up in these letters. So again, the vocabulary is different. So when you take all of that together, the one more thing too, right? They also have references to travels, right? They're written in Paul's voice to these two people, Timothy and Titus, whom we know from other New Testament writings were associates of Paul's. But Paul refers to certain places he's visited, and it's very hard to fit these into a timeline. Right? If you map out what we can tell about Paul's life and ministry, literally how many years he has, where he claims to have been, how long he was there, how long it took to travel places, it's really difficult to figure out how this would have fit. So there's a lot of things that make it sound like this might have been written later. And so I say most critical scholars, critical doesn't mean necessarily, pessimistic or, always harping on you. It just means you're willing to ask questions. Conclude that they probably were not written by Paul. And Margaret introduced that last week, if you were here last week. Anybody remember the word she used to describe this phenomenon? I hear a lot of mumbling. Pseudonymity. Pseudonymity, right? A book, that's when it has a different name, or pseudepigraphy is the idea of writing something in somebody else's name. Which again, like Margaret said, was not unheard of in the ancient world. It was often a way in which followers of a person or admirers of a person might try to inject that person's voice into new situations. It would be if I sat down and wrote like a letter to the editor in like Abraham Lincoln's name to comment on current events, right? It might be interesting. It might be a creative way of saying, I wonder what Lincoln would think about all of this. Or choose anybody else, right, from history. People would know Lincoln probably didn't write this, right? There's a kind of an agreed upon fiction that probably takes place with some of these. And it's considered a way of honoring that person's ideas, that person's legacy. Does that make sense? So I'm very skeptical that these could have been written by Paul. I think the evidence suggests, for a number of reasons, the kind of way it describes the church, the language, the vocabulary that we talked about, they were probably written around the year 100. Paul was put to death somewhere around the year 63, 64, as best we can tell. So significantly later, right, a full generation after Paul's death is when these letters come around, anywhere between 95 and 105, which makes these some of the latest documents written that are in the New Testament. In other words, latest, newest, I guess. How about that? When we look at 2 Peter, we'll see another one of those. So these show us a writer, we don't know who, writing in Paul's name, addressing churches to help them with what they're going through at a time when the Christian church is now about 70 years old. So what's going on after 70 years of the church's existence? Well, in some places it was more difficult to be a believer than it was in other places. Some places you're undergoing various kinds of persecution, perhaps, or at least some kind of social ostracism, perhaps losing business clients or maybe family members who think you're a little bit strange for worshiping only one God. So that's part of it. Also, Jesus had not returned. As best we can tell, the first generation or two of the Christian church, there was a high degree of anticipation of Christ's return. By the year 100, he hadn't come back. We see in some of the letters that Margaret will be talking about 2 weeks from now, a kind of anxiety about that, a kind of worry about attrition, that the church seems to be losing members because some people are saying, this is just too hard, or perhaps, you promised me Jesus, and where is he? And, I'm going back to Athena, or something like that. You also have had leadership turnover in some of these congregations. If these are churches that were founded around the year 40, for example, probably by the year 100, their leadership has turned over multiple times. That is sometimes a stressful thing for institutions of any kind, or for nations, or for congregations, right? When leadership changes, everything changes, people get anxious, and there's questions, right? How do we choose the next leader? What's the right way to choose? What are we looking for in a leader? We're not the first people to undergo that, and it puts strain on institutions and communities. Something that scholars kind of politely call the parting of the ways was taking place. The parting of the ways is the gradual distinction between Christian faith and Judaism, right? For the first several generations of the church, first couple of generations of the church, people who followed Jesus Christ were largely intermingled with synagogue communities, or at least not openly hostile to them. By the time you hit year 100, those ties are definitely starting to fray. By the time you hit the year 150, there's a lot of hostility being tossed back and forth between church and synagogue. That's what I mean by the parting of the ways. That also puts strain on a Christian community. It also puts not just social strain, right, but theological strain. Like, what's going on here? Can we trust them or not? Can we trust God or not? I thought Jesus was the Messiah sent to Israel, right? What's going on here? So those are some of the things that could have been going on. Plus also new ideas, right? Somebody in the next village starts preaching a different way, and you're thinking, that doesn't quite sound right. Are we still part of the same circle, or are we not? So these letters have a lot of concern about what false teaching might look like. Does that make sense to some of the basics in terms of situating us in these letters? All right, we'll see where that hits the road as we go forward. So those are the basics about these three letters. I'm going to start with the letter to Titus. This appears third in the sequence in the New Testament. But it's it's the shortest of the three, and it introduces some themes, I think, in some helpful ways. Titus was again a companion of Paul's, and so this is a very rough outline of the letter, only 3 chapters long. It starts off with criteria for elders and bishops. What are you looking for in an elder and a bishop? This has some advice, and the advice is not they should know how to elder well, they should know how to bishop well. The advice is largely about what kind of people they are. It's largely about character. So these letters, all 3 letters, especially 1 Timothy and Titus, make reference to these church offices. What's frustrating is they never reveal what exactly the people in these offices do. Like, what's the difference between a bishop and an elder and a deacon? We're really not sure, because the letters never say this is what a bishop does. And it never says if you want to be a good elder, you should be able to do X, Y, and Z. It just says an elder should be this kind of a person. So it's very concerned about kind of the moral qualifications or the character qualifications of these people. Then the letter goes to offering exhortations to various groups. We saw household codes last week when Margaret taught. Remember those? Things like, right, submit to one another, wives be subject to your husbands, children submit to your parents, slaves submit to your masters, which is a common kind of form of moral exhortation that we also see in non-Christian literature of the day. This is something moralistic philosophers were writing about. So we saw that in both Ephesians and Colossians last week. Titus also has a household code. Instead of, though, addressing people directly, instead of saying, fathers do this, or wives do this, or slaves do that, children do this, it's saying to Titus, right, be sure to tell the people that, right? Be sure to tell the parents that. Be sure to tell the wives that. So it has this household code structure. It has a reminder that we are heirs alongside Christ. There's theology in these letters, too. They talk about God. They encourage people about who God is. It's not just about leadership and structure. And then at the end, exhortations about avoiding dissension and quarrelsome people. So these letters have a strong concern with unity, with holding everything together, right? And telling Titus, basically, if people are disposed to be argumentative, just don't worry about them, is kind of the advice. Not bad advice in some places, but, we teach pastors a little bit differently today, slightly. All right, 1 Timothy, what's going on there? Look at this icon. Timothy looks rather young compared to all the other, gray-haired men that I'm putting up. There's not a lot of art about these letters. The church tradition has remembered Timothy as being very young. In one of these letters, Paul says, don't let anybody despise you because of your youth. It's often read at the ordination service when somebody's in their 20s. You can count on it. It's like clockwork. What does this talk about? Proper instruction, right? It starts off saying, you need to be able to instruct people properly. What does ministry look like? In the imagination of this letter, it's largely about instructing, making sure people know the stuff they're supposed to know. Also, proper worship. What does worship look like when it's done correctly? I'll come back to this one. This is where we have a rather notorious passage there. A criteria for bishops and deacons, right? What kind of people do you want in these roles? Warnings about asceticism. So like saying kind of don't be taken in by these other teachers who are saying that that the Christian life is all about what you give up, right? All about the ways in which you deprive yourself. So we get a sense that there's conversation or maybe some disagreement going on among churches about what proper Christian practice is supposed to look like. Instructions about widows and elders. The elders here it's a church office of some kind. And this is a letter that's very worried about widows for some reason, some group of widows. It talks about enrolling them and putting them on a list. We're not quite sure what that list is. It could be a leadership kind of thing. In other words, this could be, when the letter talks about widows, this could be a kind of quasi-monastic movement that's taking place. In other words, there could be communities of women who have taken some kind of religious vow and are kind of not creating their own church, but this definitely recognizable unit within this church. It talks about making sure that the widows are really widows. And what that means is not necessarily did they really have a husband who's passed away, but rather are they really committed to this movement? In other words, it could have been a multi-generational kind of movement. Women who took on a vow of celibacy, perhaps, to live in these female communities. Does that make sense? kind of what could be going on. We know this, there's references in other Christian literature after the New Testament to groups that are described as virgins who are called widows, and those appear to be, again, these monastic movements of people who took vows of celibacy, women at least. In the Christian church, it appears that female monasticism arose before male monasticism in the second century. Fun fact there. That's something you can drop at lunch, if you're having lunch with somebody who wasn't here. So again, a lot of concerns about structure and order in these churches. Warnings about false teachings and false teachers. And something that I think is really, really telling, one of the final lines of this letter to the reader, to Timothy, is guard the deposit, which I find to be really interesting language, right? That faith here sounds really different than what Paul was talking about back when we looked at things like Galatians and Romans, right? Where faith was about trust, was about living into this kind of participation with Jesus Christ, with experiencing new life right here and now. And the way that these letters, 1 Timothy in particular, talk about faith is largely about you've been handed something, now hold on to it, right? Don't break it. It's your job to hold on to this for the next generation. And so it uses expressions like the faith. 2 Timothy will talk about keep the faith. You hear the difference in that? Keep the faith is different from live faithfully. Right? Live faithfully has much more of a sense of participation, day-to-day, one's own agency. When you talk about guard the deposit of faith, guard what's been passed along to you, we're getting the sense of a tradition that has to be kept. I'm not against traditions. I like some of them. But notice the change, the subtle change that's going on here. A lot of this instruction is don't mess up what you've been handed, Timothy. Right? Keep doing what you know to be true. There's a suspicion of innovative ways of thinking in these letters that we should note. More on that in a minute. Second letter to Timothy. This one's a little bit different from the other two in that it's styled as what we refer to as a testament. And a testament was a form of ancient writing in which a revered leader, as they were nearing their death, would write down like instructions for those who would come after them. At the end of Genesis, there's a long section that's a testament where Jacob is instructing his sons how he wants them to live. Right? We talk about last will and testament. We think about those largely as legal documents. They're largely about, where are my assets going to go and things like that. But this kind of a testament was largely about, this is what I want you to do. Think about a deathbed speech, in movies or drama or maybe even in your own life where somebody says, this is what I really hope you will do when I'm gone, or this is how I want you to remember me. And so in 2 Timothy, we get a sense, at least the voice it's written in is, Paul's on his way out. He talks about the roots of Timothy's faith. He refers to his mother and his grandmother, Lois and Eunice, and talks about the way in which the faith Timothy was handed down to him by these women in his life, by his grandmother and mother. Exhortations, right, to endure, to pass along Paul's teaching and to remain single-minded. So again, you have this sense of take what you've been given and guard it. Ministry is largely described or characterized as instruction, make sure people believe the right things, exhortation, make people live the right way, and steadfastness, right? Make sure people hold up when things get tough, make sure people endure during persecution, for example. And then it ends with exhortations to imitate Paul. Right? How should you live? Well, just live how I lived, including Paul's faithfulness, Paul's endurance in suffering, and Paul's persistence in preaching the gospel. I might have mentioned this a few weeks ago, but when we read into the second century, so even past these letters, right? This letter is 100, around the beginning of the second century. The way Paul is remembered in the church is not so much because of his theology, but rather it's because of his character. Right? In other words, he's largely praised as somebody who just kept going, right? Who persisted, who underwent suffering without giving up, and was kind of modeled this life of faithful endurance. And we see that in some ways being set up in this letter. All right. That's the basics of these. We're going to dig down to some themes in just a minute. But first I want to do some more quick discussion. So simple questions, I promise. And the first one's not going to look simple because there's going to be a lot of art, but it's just this. Is there a metaphor for the church that you like. So I threw a couple up here, right? One's the flock, sheep, shepherding the flock. Is the church like a hospital? Is the church like some kind of a castle or a walled fortress? Is the church a playground for you? The one in the middle there, the big one, is like a military base. There are people who will talk about the church in that way. We've got the body of Christ there, little people making up Jesus' body, or a boat, right, keeping you on the storm-tossed seas. There are others. Maybe you can think of some. But is there a metaphor for the church that you like? Is there a metaphor for the church that you don't like or that you find problematic? And again, this can be anything you've ever heard in your life, or it can be, the church that your neighbors go to or whatever. And third, if you could propose a new metaphor for the church, what would that be? What would that be? Like a dog park or something like that, where everybody's just thrilled to be there. See, you get to make up your own. Does that make sense? All right, I'm just going to give you just 5 minutes for these. So don't, just use your creativity. There are no wrong answers here. There might be some dangerous answers, but there's no wrong answers here. All right, and folks online, feel free to use the chat for these. All right. I need a volunteer to write words on the whiteboard. If anybody is a whiteboard scribble kind of person who wants to volunteer to write on the board, that'd be great. I'm just going to ask for feedback on question 3, and we're going to write these down here. I don't think we've got a laptop in the room for online people. Apologies. But Ken does have a microphone, but if you also just want to yell them out, I can repeat them. Number 3, what were some of your proposals? A school. A school for wise living. School for wise living. Others? Forest. A forest. We have a request for more information. Like a scary forest?
No.
Or a happy forest?
The wilderness.
Okay. Wilderness and the sanctuary of trees. Westminster Hall is designed to look like a clearing in the forest. Others?
I said hope, and it's really from the Presbyterian disaster assistance, out of chaos, hope.
Out of chaos, hope. So not just random hope, but like literally rooted in.
Yeah, we're in chaos, and the church represents hope.
Yeah, excellent.
Community.
Community.
We had whitewater rafting. Rafting after Jesus, who kind of like gets through the rough water. Do you kind of follow that same way so you don't overturn?
All right, whitewater rafting. You're trying to keep up with Jesus, who seems to be having an easier time with the rapids than you are.
A big tent.
A big tent.
Well, riffing on the water theme, we talked about a place of living water, maybe within a campground, or maybe it's the boat as well, or gathering around a well of some sort.
Excellent. So a source of water of some kind, gathering around a well, perhaps in a community or a encampment. Yeah. Home. Another one. Comfort, nurturing. Going to grandma's house when you're a kid. That's mine. All right. So as you look at these, we've got a school for wisdom, thank you, and we've got a forest and the sense of sanctuary, hope, community, whitewater rafting, big tent, living water, home, comfort, and nurturing. Think about what kind of leadership do you need for each of those? It's not the same for each one necessarily, is it? Wisdom always helps. But it's different, right? The metaphor you use for a church is going to influence how you imagine how we're going to run this thing. If I'm gathered around a well, I want to make sure at least somebody knows something about water purification. So that's my only criterion, right? All those kinds of things. Whitewater rafting, you would imagine somebody who's been there before, somebody who knows what to do in times of danger, right? The way these metaphors work matter for how we think about what you need to hold it all together and to move forward and carry out your mission, if you want to use that language as well. I bring this up because I think that's important for understanding these letters, because these letters have their own particular metaphors, their own kind of values that they put out there for the church, which affects the way in which they think about, now what kind of a leader do we need? So I want to illustrate that because the primary metaphor that these letters use for the church is one of household. And let me just illustrate that. So this is from 1 Timothy. I hope to come to you soon, but I am writing these instructions to you, so that if I'm delayed, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and support of the truth. So notice that. Look at the language of pillar and support, right? Sounds like strength, right? You're holding something up. You're making sure it's sturdy. A household in Greco-Roman culture, so the Roman Empire is about 100 years old at this point in time, and the household is the primary metaphor as well that the empire uses to describe itself. Who's the emperor? Who's the Caesar? He's the head of the household, quite literally, right? He's at the top of the hierarchy, the social hierarchy. Retainers and other, elites beneath him, and everything kind of filters downward in the Roman Empire. And moralistic philosophers and propaganda writers in the Roman world would talk about the household, right, as the basic kind of fundamental social and economic building block in the society. And a well-run household was supposed to do what? It was supposed to imitate the empire. So the paterfamilias, everybody knows that expression, right? Literally the father of the family, the head of the household. You can still do that in your taxes, right? You can still file as head of household. That comes in some ways from this cultural setting. There's a head of the household, almost always male, except in some elite, wealthy households, or households that didn't have a male. But for the most part, in the quote unquote conventional Greco-Roman household, you had a male who, and everybody beneath that person kind of fell in line to where they were, which is why those household codes last week, right? Imagine this hierarchical structure. If the households mirror the empire, everybody's going to get along just great. That's the conventional imperial way of thinking in the Roman world. So what's striking about these letters is they appear to be adopting that imagery and that metaphor for the church as well, right? So a household isn't just the people you're related to in the Roman world. If you're what we might call kind of a middle class or kind of an artisan or a merchant household, you're going to have extended family living under your roof, but your household might include as well enslaved people. It might include clients, business clients, who might literally live with you or at least kind of be conceived as under your roof or under your care. So in other words, a household could be a really, really large group. And those household codes, right, and a lot of ways of thinking in the Greco-Roman world is you have to know your place in the household. You have to know to whom you're subject and who's beneath you, and you have to fulfill your role right. And if you do that, everything's going to be just hunky-dory is the Greek word for that. So notice that spilling in here in 1 Timothy.
May I ask a question?
Please.
Going back to the last piece. You told us a moment ago that Paul didn't write this, someone else did. So what are we to make of the introductory clause? I hope to come to you soon. Is that simply taking Paul's position and saying, well, if Paul were alive now, he would like to come and see you soon, and so I'm opening with these words of concern or care for you? Yeah. Or is the actual author speaking as though this were Paul, with the actual author saying, I'm coming to your community, or I hope to come to your community?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the answer is probably the second, probably the latter, that it's probably the author of the letter writing in Paul's voice and adding personal details. So this isn't the only place that happens. For example, at one point, Paul talks about bringing the books that he left at somebody's house. So there are these occasional sentences that are very personal, right, and describe an upcoming visit or describe kinds of connections. One possibility is Paul wrote them, and I'm wrong, and very wrong. Another possibility is that part of this way of writing was tried. One of the ways it was supposed to be written was to create this realistic fiction, like to make the letter as realistic as possible and to kind of make it seem like, oh, this is really coming from Paul because this is not just doing business. This is also Paul talking about his relationship to these readers and to these churches. Okay, good question. Another one from 1 Timothy 3. The saying is sure, whoever aspires to the office of bishop desires a noble task. All right? And at the end of this saying, it's going to say, for if someone doesn't know how to manage his own household, how can he take care of God's church? The he there is deliberate, right? This letter does not imagine bishops being anything other than men. But what's in between there, in terms of what's going on, the saying is sure, whoever aspires to the office of bishop desires a noble task. Now a bishop must be above reproach, married only once, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, and apt teacher, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, and not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well, keeping his children submissive and respectful in every way. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how can he take care of God's church? So notice what's going on here, right? What do we want as a bishop? Not somebody who's good at bishoping. We want somebody who's very respectable, right? Who follows the rules, who keeps his own household in order, right? Everybody knows their place. And that then is the criterion, right, for can they manage the church well? So in other words, you see this connection between a good household and a good church all of a sudden start to be merged. Does that make sense? All right. Also, a big focus on respectability and in the eyes of outsiders. So here's from Titus. For the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation to all. See, there's theology in these letters. That's great. I like that sentence. Training us to renounce impiety and worldly passions in the present age, to live lives that are self-controlled, upright, and godly. Like nothing in here necessarily about, advocacy or, preaching the gospel in certain ways, right? Self-control, kind of moral uprightness and godliness, while we wait for the blessed hope and the manifestation of the glory of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ. So this idea of kind of respectable morals in the world. Titus 3:1, remind them to be subject to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, and to be ready for every good work. So again, very much kind of a conciliatory, don't stick your neck out, right? Don't make waves. Likewise, this is more from Titus, I'm jumping around in the books here, urge the younger men to be self-controlled in all things, offering yourself as a model of good works, and in your teaching offering integrity, gravity, and sound speech that cannot be censured. Then any opponent will be put to shame, having nothing evil to say of us. Think of the neighbors, right? Make sure the neighbors aren't suspicious of us, right? There's very much kind of a desire in these letters to fit in with conventional moral values of the day. One more, but I mentioned the widows earlier. Honor widows who are really widows, right? If a widow has children or grandchildren, they should first learn the religious duty to their own family and make some repayment to their parents, for this is pleasing in God's sight. Some of you might want to send this along to your families later today. Some of you might have remembered something you heard in the news this week as well, when you see language like that, right? Give these commands as well so that they may be above reproach. Right? That's that line, above reproach, right? Not open to criticism. And whoever does not provide for relatives, and especially for family members, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So very much this internal focus, right? We've got to take care of our own. We've got to take care of our own. What kind of institutions do that or make that move? Often institutions that are under stress, right? Institutions that are worried about their survival. Not always, but sometimes that's part of it. So again, there's this focus on not looking weird in the culture, right? Morally, in terms of one's own behavior, right? Follow the rules, follow these conventions. And then the most notorious passage in all of this, Margaret kind of nodded toward this last week, but here's part of 1 Timothy talks about proper ways of worship in chapter 2. And this is where we get the New Testament's most strongly worded denial of women having leadership roles in the public life of a church. So the author says, I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or argument. Also that the women should dress themselves in moderate clothing with reverence and self-control, not with their hair braided or with gold, pearls, or expensive clothes, but with good works, as is proper for women who profess reverence for God. It's a long sentence. Laura Holmes talks about this, says, remember, the context here is prayer. The context here seems to be what happens when the community is gathered. But interesting, right? This idea of men being engaged in prayer, while women, the concern is all about how they look, right? And this idea of not being too showy, right? Not showing off wealth or things like that, but to adorn themselves with good works. Let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. Now here's the rationale, which is a little odd. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. I'm not so sure the author is reading Genesis 2 and 3 correctly there, but this author got in the Bible and I didn't. So, yet she will be saved through childbearing. Don't know what that means. Provided they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control. So a lot going on here, right? One question is this a prohibition for a particular community because the author is concerned that there's a group of women who perhaps are just exercising too much power, is a possibility. Is this meant to be a blanket statement? One thing to remember is people don't write things like this unless what they're writing against is going on, right? In other words, the fact that somebody feels like they've got to say this so strongly suggests that in the year 100, there are still women who are offering public leadership in congregations. So don't miss that, right? Just because somebody says something in a letter doesn't mean everybody does it or agrees with it. So to note that. Obviously, this is a passage that's been used over and over and over again. I could bring in a panel of seminary students who will tell you all the relatives and friends who cited this to them or who wrote them letters with this and told them they were making a huge mistake by seeking ordained ministry, which is relatively normal for us in a church like Westminster. We've only been ordaining women in this denomination, however, for, I've even forgotten how many years. What are we at now? Around 75-ish? Give or take? A few nods. Okay. Not that long in the grand scheme of things. And of course, if you look at Christianity writ large across the globe in all sorts of different denominations, we're very much a minority in this. Not to say we're doing anything wrong, but just to say this is a passage that's been used in a variety of ways to disempower folks, and still is all of the time. And we could talk about it for hours, and I'm happy to do that in other settings. The thing I wanted you to see, though, is notice how this comes in the midst of letters that are very concerned about, again, respectability, right? This idea of make sure the neighbors don't think we're doing anything weird over here. And so that could be part of what's going on here. The kinds of commands that this passage gives, we also see in other Greco-Roman moralistic writings, written all by men, of course, right? But this idea of female submission to the men in their lives. And when you see women and men there, those can also be translated wives and husbands. But one of the ways that's expressed is largely in the way in which somebody is supposed to look demure in public, right? Not call attention to themselves in any way. Where does this come from? This comes in a lot of ways from that imperial understanding, right, of what is a well-run empire supposed to look like. Betty.
So it's such a contrast for me. The words that are written and the demonstration by Jesus Christ. And so it's such, to me, this is where, man rises up and says, this is what you do for God, rather than what Jesus said and what Jesus did. It's kind of like, do as I'm doing. So there's a big contrast. But I also wanted to go back to the previous slide about widows just for a second and say, I've come across different interpretations of the word widows over a lifespan. And one of them was when I was in Palestine and I met the wives of the martyrs. They weren't all wives. They were considered widows, but the martyrs were either dead or they were imprisoned. And so the idea of wives and widows was expanded there. And the other place was when my father called me a green grass widow when my first husband walked out the door and kept walking. And I thought, wow, that was an expression from the early 1900s, that a green grass widow was a woman who was left because the grass is always greener on the other side. And so, the interpretation of widow, I think, means maleless women. Women, not necessarily the ones who aren't married yet, because they'll be married off by their fathers to somebody or enslaved. But the women who either had children and grandchildren, and their husband died, or their husband left, or disappeared, whatever. And so understanding that honor those who are the real widows might go back to your faith piece, that they had a community, that they created a community of faith, and maybe they became nuns later on. I don't know.
Yeah. Right. I mean, whatever this group of widows are that the letter says, make sure they're registered or on this list or something. There is concern? Some of those concern is that they're gossips. It's all these gendered stereotypes are in there, but there does seem to be concern they kind of they have a little bit too much power, right, if they're together, which could definitely suggest that this is a group within the church that's either teaching its own stuff or leading its own services or finding ways to care for one another spiritually and materially as well. To go back to this one, like you said, right, I hope you do all notice the difference from what Jesus taught, lived, and acted to what we see going on here. Even Paul, in some ways, right? We've got a church. What seems to be going on is we've got a church that's now wrestling with the idea of being an institution. I'm not against institutions, but we all know, right, things become institutionalized then, and they get concerned about their own survival, right? Or people who take power or have power don't want to yield power and things like that. And we see that going on. So if you're looking at this saying, how in the world does this fit in the New Testament? You're not the first person to wonder that, right? And so that means with instructions like this, we have to ask the question, who's saying this and why are they saying it? And on what basis are they saying it? Sorry, I didn't mean to restate what Betty said, but in terms of what do we do with it? Like, where does this come from? Part of it comes from the passage of time and the strain of institution, and perhaps even a kind of leaving behind of old theologies that shouldn't have been left behind. Mark.
Yeah, I wanted to go back and just question or comment on your emphasis on respectability within Roman society. This is a gross generalization on my part, but I read Roman society as having sort of 2 points of view. The one was virtuous living, simplicity, and the other was hedonistic excess, whether it's bread and circuses or, Caligula or Nero, these Roman emperors that were embodying that. So from that perspective, this seems to be trying to build an alliance between the Christian church and, if you will, the virtuous Romans who advocated for a kind of simplicity and uprightness. And I just throw that out as a question or comment.
Yeah, this definitely has more in common with like moralistic philosophers of the time than it does with, for example, imperial propaganda or things like that, for sure. Ken, what? 2 more, and then I'm gonna. 10:09.
Were they trying to compete with the synagogues where women
Oh, were they
had
trying
no
to compete
role?
with the synagogues? Some women did have roles in some synagogues. A lot of that depends more on class than on gender, as best we can tell. One of the ways in Roman society for women to have access to public power of some sorts was through religion, whether those are Greco-Roman religious experiences, in some cases synagogues, and at least early on in the church. So that's interesting as well, right? How much of this is trying to make the church look different from what's going on down the street, perhaps at some other place. And women of various classes could sometimes find avenues for leadership in religious movements. Some religious movements were entirely male, like were restricted to people in the army and things like that, and they tended to be really the second group that Mark was talking about, kind of pretty debauched as best we can tell. Does that help?
I think it's interesting, he was influenced by his mother and his grandmother.
Exactly right. That's, yeah.
Other stuff.
The role of Lois and Eunice is really held up, yeah.
I remember, I keep in mind that Christians at that time were Jews, primarily, coming out of a Jewish religion. And in 70 AD, the siege of the temple and the diaspora of the Jews, if I was a small cult group and I was trying to figure out how I was going to survive, I'd keep my head down and I would tell everybody to keep their mouth shut. The question I have, and that's what this text does really, it says, here's how we should operate, but don't raise your head above the water, because somebody's going to see it and they're going to, Jesus was killed. So they're gonna kill us. But the question I have is fundamental for me. It's always been since I went to seminary in 1976. Is this normative as a polity for the 21st century?
Right.
And that I've never got an answer from, because I'll go with the conservative evangelical view, which is, well, this is normative. And then I turn to them and say, do you have a bishop? Well, okay, let's change the word to Greek. Presbyter? Oh, no, we have a pastor. Oh, wait a minute. So your structure of your church, what is it? Oh, we have a corporate structure. What do you mean? We have a leadership team. Where is that in the Bible? Oh, well, see, their polity doesn't match with the first century, but they pick and choose what they think should be normative into the future. Now, I'm not saying this is or isn't. I'm just saying that question for me is huge. And most of these household codes, I don't see them normative. And nobody thought when they wrote this that 2,000 years later, this would be normative for a church in the 21st century. So I just set it aside going, works for you, doesn't work for us. Let's figure out what works for us.
Yeah. Yeah, what you're getting at there, Paul, that's helpful, are ways in which, how do we know what's normative? Like, how do we read this book? How do we to go back to what Betty said, what Jesus' pattern is as more authoritative than this, for example? You can make that argument, but you need to talk about it, right? And what's dangerous is when people are just like, well, here's a verse, I'm going to use this. This is on our list of what's normative and what's not. And you can do horrible things with the Bible that way. We might be guilty of doing that in some ways with the Bible in certain ways. And so, I mean, you're always talking about what things do you listen to more closely and more loudly than what other ones. I'm running short on time. I apologize for that. Responding to these letters, I just want to say, we could talk about this historically, theologically, vocationally. Historically, is Jesus leading an egalitarian movement? Maybe not the way we would define that. His disciples are all men, as best we can tell from the Bible. There are clear indications that there are among his disciples, I mean the 12 apostles, but among his disciples, consistent disciples, are women as well, who are noted, who are lifted up. Paul's ministry, he's partnering with women. So I mean, historically, we can say, where do you want to look? What's normative? Is what's going on in the year 30 when Jesus is doing his public ministry normative? Is this letter from the year 100 normative? Is this passage, not this passage, previous one, normative, right? So historically, what are you preferencing? What are you privileging? Theologically, are there some voices that speak more loudly than what we've just seen? Can we make a case that a church that's deeply concerned with its survival and respectability might be forfeiting or might be abandoning some aspects of what Jesus calls us to do and to be? I think that's true with these letters. I had a student once who talked about these letters being her favorite part of the Bible, and the reason was she came from a country where it's very, very dangerous to be a Christian. And I kept pressing her on that, like, why were these letters? And she just said, because it's a reminder that our best people can lead us in times of like great danger. And I thought, that's so far out of my experience, right? But if you're worried, like somebody's going to come and kill us on Sunday morning when we gather for worship, you can imagine how certain kinds of norms of leader. And for her, it wasn't so much the gendered part. It was just simply, we need our best people. And by her, she meant people of character as leaders. So I want to respect that. At the same time, I don't ever want to read 1 Timothy 2 in church. So, vocationally, what has God called us to do, and how does that matter more than what the Bible might command or prohibit? Right? How are we called to be and to do certain people? These are conversations that we make all the time in our heads as we look at these texts. We just don't always voice them or lay all the texts out on the table and talk about it. But It's one of the reasons why Margaret and I thought it was important to teach on these books, right? Just to say these passages are there, these attitudes are there. Oh, it's 10:15, so we'll do the remember slide. Every biblical book has parts that resonate with your values or your theology and parts that clash. There are a couple of good verses in these books. Jesus says some things in the Gospels that I really don't know what to do with and that don't always quite fit. So just to note that. And the second one is consider the popularity of these books in some quarters. 2 Timothy is a very popular book in a lot of churches, especially among men's groups. Remember the Promise Keepers back in the day? Remember that group in Muscular Christianity? They loved 2 Timothy, right? It's all got a lot of athletic imagery in there. Got a lot of like farming imagery in there. It's got a lot of imagery about muscular Christianity, right? Be strong, like, carry this through to the end, right? Get the ball across the end zone line, something like that, right? There's all that kind of language in there. The book of Ephesians that Margaret talked about last week, similarly, very, very popular in a lot of churches in this country. Not that there's anything wrong with the books in general, but just to note, we're seeing this. We've seen it now for 2 weeks and before, right? But one of the things that's coming to the surface in a lot of the news are different versions of Christianity that we might know are out there, but now the media is trying to parse out, like, what makes Marianne Buddy different from whoever taught J.D. Vance about being good to your family before you're good to others? You know what I mean? What's behind that is politics, yes, but beyond that as well are different theological visions, right? Ways in which we grab onto certain texts and certain ideas. So it's been fun to go through the New Testament, and we're not done yet. But one of the things we also have to think about is how do we sort these books out, right? How do we give privilege to some or to some teachings? But hopefully looking at the historical, theological, and vocational differences is helpful to you. We're out of time, so you can take a picture of this with your camera if you want, talk about it on your way home. But what might lead a congregation or community to become concerned with pursuing respectability? And is it inevitable that Christian groups will find themselves adopting cultural norms and virtues? And when can that become problematic? We're not the only ones with good ideas. But we're also not the only ones with bad ideas. Excuse me. Next week, the letter to the Hebrews, a really different theological terrain universe. With a special guest preacher named Kathy Michael. So that'll be great fun next week. All right. Thank you. Sorry to keep you a little late there. That's all my fault.